Welcome to Justice Reloaded HD. Have you ever watched an entire room burst into laughter? Not because something was funny, but because no one really understood what they were witnessing? Sometimes, the bravest thing someone can do is simply hold another human being when the world tells them not to. Today's story begins with a single lift, done at the wrong time, in the wrong place, and ends with a man who walked in and couldn't take one more step. If you believe some people do the right thing at the worst moment, under the harshest gaze, like and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. Stick around, because today's laughter ends in a silence you won't forget. It was just past noon, and the upscale bistro in downtown Chicago was bursting at the seams. Waitstaff darted between tables, balancing trays of seared salmon and truffle fries, their movements clipped and mechanical. Customers talked over each other, voices rising above the low hum of jazz playing over the speakers. The clink of cutlery, the rush of espresso machines, and the impatient snap of fingers created a backdrop of barely contained chaos. Somewhere in the middle of this lunch-hour storm, an 8-year-old boy limped awkwardly behind a tall, well-dressed woman whose eyes were fixed not on him, but on the phone pressed tightly against her ear. Her stilettos clicked with purpose. His small orthopedic braces clicked with uncertainty. His name was Caleb. A fragile boy with delicate limbs that didn't always obey him. His gait was uneven, hesitant. He didn't cry when he struggled. He had long since learned that crying didn't help. As the woman, his stepmother, turned sharply around a corner toward a table near the window, Caleb tried to follow. But the floor was slippery with condensation from a dropped iced tea, and the moment his heel landed just off-center, his body gave out beneath him. He collapsed onto the polished floor with a soft thud, knees splayed, arms tangled, the braces on his legs scraping loudly against the tiles. The woman didn't turn around. The conversation on her phone was apparently too important. For a moment, no one moved. Then, the laughter started. A low snicker from a corner booth. A smirk from a businessman in a navy suit. A muttered voice, just loud enough to cut. Who brings that into a place like this? A fork clinked loudly onto a plate. At that exact moment, a young waitress named Nora had just emerged from the kitchen. She was new. Her name tag still gleamed like it hadn't seen a full week of shifts. She was carrying a tray of sparkling water, which she had expertly balanced despite the sweat already beading on her neck. She froze mid-step when she saw Caleb on the floor. For a second, she did what everyone else did, nothing. Then, unlike everyone else, she moved. Without a word, Nora set her tray gently down on the nearest table, ignoring the surprised stares of the guests seated there. She stepped out of line, out of protocol, and knelt down in the middle of the aisle beside the boy. She didn't ask for permission. She simply slipped her arms under Caleb's small frame and lifted him up. Her movement wasn't hurried, nor was it performative. She held him the way someone holds a child they've held before. One arm under his knees, one behind his shoulders, cradling him as though he weighed nothing and everything at once. Caleb didn't resist. His body melted into hers like it had been waiting for this. He clutched the collar of her uniform shirt, his tiny fingers curling tightly. The laughter grew louder for a moment, confused and mocking. What is this? She moonlights as a babysitter. A 5-star restaurant, and now we've got live-in nannies? Nora didn't respond. She didn't explain. She just stood there in the center of the room, holding him like it was the most natural thing in the world. The laughter faltered. A few faces flushed with awkward guilt. Others turned away, unsure how to interpret what they were witnessing. But Nora wasn't looking at them. She looked only at Caleb, who had laid his head softly against her shoulder. His breath began to slow, the stiffness in his limbs giving way to something softer, something trusting. No one else in the restaurant moved. Even the waitstaff paused. In that moment, everything Nora had ever learned caring for her younger brother, who had the same uneven walk, the same hollow look when ignored, came rushing back. She hadn't come to this job for heroics. She'd come because she needed the money. But now, money felt like the smallest reason in the world to do what was right. As she began walking slowly toward the table Caleb had been heading to, still carrying him, people parted like a tide. Not out of respect, but out of sheer confusion. And at the edge of the dining room, just out of sight, a man had entered. But his moment would come next. Nora didn't put him down. The air inside the restaurant felt heavier now, as if time had thickened around them. She held Caleb against her chest, his body tucked into the crook of her arm like it had always belonged there. His cheek was warm against her shoulder, his breath shallow but calming. He didn't ask questions. Neither did she. The eyes around them didn't disappear. She felt them, burning, questioning, some still amused, others now puzzled. But Nora didn't look up to meet them. She wasn't carrying a burden. She wasn't carrying a mistake. She was carrying a boy who needed to be held longer than the world had allowed him to be. Her footsteps were slow as she moved through the maze of tables, each one a small island of judgment. The stairs were sharp, like ice in her path. Some guests leaned back to let her pass, others simply stared in disbelief. A few whispered behind napkins. But Nora's grip never loosened. Caleb didn't squirm. He didn't look for the woman who had left him behind. He had curled into her like someone who finally found gravity that made sense. "You don't have to walk fast," she whispered into the space between them, her voice barely a thread. "You're not late for being you." She didn't expect him to respond. But after a beat, she felt it, his tiny hand gripping the collar of her shirt. Not hard. Not scared. Just there, holding. Then his head rested fully on her shoulder. The tension in his limbs softened. His breathing, shallow and uneven at first, began to level out. In all her years caring for her younger brother, through meltdowns and hospital visits, through wheelchairs and stares from strangers, Nora had learned one unshakable truth. Sometimes the thing a child needs most isn't encouragement to stand, but permission to rest. She walked him to the far corner booth. It wasn't where he was originally heading, but it was quiet. There, the light from the window stretched long across the table, warm and golden. A water glass sat untouched at the edge of the table, condensation pooling beneath it. Nora lowered herself gently into the booth, keeping Caleb in her arms. She didn't shift him away, didn't treat him like a job to be done or a scene to be cleaned up. One of the other waiters, a young man with gelled hair and too much panic in his eyes, hovered nearby. "Nora," he muttered. You can't just. I mean, the floor managers." She looked at him. Not coldly. Not defiantly. Just a quiet look that said, "This isn't about you right now." He swallowed his words and walked away. Caleb shifted slightly. She adjusted without thinking, keeping him close, safe. It wasn't about making a statement. It wasn't about going viral. It was instinct. It was care. Every once in a while, someone would glance over. The stares had changed. Some were still confused. Some even offended. But more than a few looked softer. Quietly curious. Still, no one said thank you. No one offered help. That was fine. Nora hadn't done it for applause. She hadn't done it for the tips. She had seen a boy fall, and everyone had watched. She had seen a boy get laughed at, and everyone had joined in. But she also saw a boy who just needed a moment. And so she gave it to him. Minutes passed. No one told her to stop. No one asked her why. She didn't need to explain. Because in her heart, she knew, this was Caleb's first moment of peace all day. And peace doesn't need justification. Marshall Hale stepped through the entrance of the restaurant with his usual quiet authority. He was a man whose presence didn't require announcement. Shoulders squared, tailored coat perfectly pressed, gray hair swept back with precision. The maitre d' had spotted him immediately and straightened his posture, ready to usher him toward his usual table. But Marshall didn't move. His polished leather shoes stopped mid-step. Because there, across the room, in the middle of the lunch hour bustle, His son was nestled in the arms of a young waitress. Not his nanny. Not his teacher. Not his physical therapist. A stranger. And yet, Caleb wasn't crying. He wasn't flailing, or panicking, or reaching for help. He was still. Peaceful. His cheek rested on the waitress's shoulder like he'd known her for years. His arms were wrapped loosely around her neck, fingers curled into the soft fabric of her uniform. And the waitress, she wasn't trying to explain herself. She wasn't hurrying to put him down or looking around for approval. She simply held his son with a grace that wasn't trained, but lived. Marshall didn't speak. He couldn't. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the clatter of forks, the buzz of lunchtime chatter, faded into a hushed stillness. It wasn't a silence born of politeness. It was the kind that slipped in when something real happens. Something undeniable. People sensed it. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. Knives froze halfway to mouths. One by one, heads turned toward the man at the door, and the boy in the arms of the woman no one had thought twice about 10 minutes earlier. Marshall stood completely still. His eyes didn't move from Caleb. Not for a second. He saw the subtle rise and fall of his son's breathing. He saw the way his hands clung, not out of fear, but comfort. And he saw her. The young woman cradling him like it wasn't the middle of a lunch rush in one of the city's most expensive restaurants. He took in every detail, her calm expression, the dirt on her apron, the faint sweat glistening at her temples from a long shift. She looked like she should be overwhelmed. But she wasn't. She looked like she understood something no one else in the room did. Nora felt the shift in the air before she saw him. She glanced up slowly, her eyes meeting Marshall's across the distance. It wasn't defiance in her gaze. It wasn't fear, either. It was something steadier. Something that said, "He's safe. I'm here." She gave him a single, small nod. Then she looked away, as if that moment had been enough, and resumed walking, Caleb still tucked against her. No grand explanation. No apology. She simply kept moving toward the table. Marshall didn't follow. He stood rooted to the floor, as if some invisible thread had tied him to that moment. The staff didn't dare approach him. The maitre d' hovered uncertainly near the host's stand, eyes flicking back and forth between his most powerful patron and the unspoken scene unraveling before them. Even the laughter that had rippled through the restaurant earlier had vanished. Whatever smugness or mockery had existed had dissolved into something else, something closer to awe. Or guilt. Or both. For a long, breathless second, no one dared to speak. Because while no words had been exchanged, everyone in that room had just witnessed something they didn't know how to name. And Marshall Hale, man of empires, of contracts and skyscrapers and closed doors, stood utterly speechless in front of a woman who had just taught his son something he himself never had. Caleb didn't let go. Not once during the meal. Not when the waiter came to pour water, not when the silverware clinked against porcelain, not even when the server brought out the amuse-bouche with a nervous smile. His small hand remained firmly wrapped around Nora's shoulder, his cheek still resting on her uniform. She sat beside him, not across from him, and no one at the table corrected her. Marshall Hale sat opposite them, motionless, the same way he had stood when he first saw them. He hadn't uttered a word since taking his seat. He didn't ask Caleb if he was all right. He didn't offer Nora a thank you or a frown. He simply sat, his jaw tight, his hands folded in front of him, as if trying to hold back something too unfamiliar to name. It was an odd meal. Not because of the food. Everything was plated perfectly, as always. Not because of the staff. They continued their service with studied professionalism. But because the air at that table was thick with a kind of fragile truce. Nora didn't try to talk. She didn't ask questions, didn't explain herself, didn't attempt to make conversation. She knew how delicate this space was. One wrong word could shatter it. So she focused on Caleb. She cut his chicken for him when he struggled with the knife. She held his cup steady when his hands wobbled. She wiped a small streak of sauce from the corner of his mouth with a quiet care that wasn't rushed or performative. Caleb didn't speak either. But every now and then he'd glance at her, just to make sure she was still there. And she always was. The other diners mostly looked away. Whether it was guilt or discomfort, no one mentioned what had happened. No one laughed anymore. And while some avoided eye contact entirely, others seemed to look just a second too long, torn between curiosity and shame. But no one said a word. Not to Nora. Not to Marshall. And certainly not to Caleb. It was as if the entire room had made a silent agreement. Don't touch that moment. Don't speak about it. Let it pass, and pretend it never happened. But the next day, Nora learned that silence didn't always mean safety. She had just finished her shift when the assistant manager called her into the back office. The room was small, overly air-conditioned, and smelled faintly of printer toner. Behind the desk sat Mr. Riley, a man who prided himself on not raising his voice, because condescension, he believed, was best delivered in polite tones. He folded his hands and gave her a look that was somewhere between apologetic and corporate. "Nora," he began, "we received a few comments." She didn't speak. She'd learned to let people fill their own silence. He continued. "About yesterday. About what happened on the floor." Still, she said nothing. "There are guidelines, you understand," he went on, "regarding physical contact with guests, especially minors." Her chest tightened. Not with shame, she had none, but with a familiar kind of dread. The kind that came when people started using words like policy and concern. "I know the situation was unusual," he said carefully, "and no one is questioning your intentions." She raised an eyebrow. That was exactly what they were doing. He cleared his throat and adjusted his tie, clearly uncomfortable. But management needs to ensure that all staff adhere to appropriate boundaries. So let this be a reminder moving forward. No physical contact with patrons unless absolutely necessary. Understood. There was a pause. Then she nodded once. Understood. That was it. No official write-up. No suspension. Just a warning tucked in the kind of voice that made it clear, "We noticed. And we won't say it again." She left the office with her apron still tied and her name tag still straight. The hallway back to the kitchen was quiet. Too quiet. None of the other staff made eye contact. Some had heard. Others hadn't. But the unspoken message hung in the air: you crossed the line. Even if it was for the right reasons. And yet, even with the sting of that warning still fresh in her chest, Nora didn't regret it. Not 1 second of it. Marshall had always believed in resilience. He raised buildings, not just children. He built towers of steel and glass, the kind that kissed the skyline and defied storms. His philosophy, both in business and in life, had been simple: if something falls, you build it back up, stronger, taller, better. That belief extended to his parenting. Especially with Caleb. Ever since the diagnosis, ever since doctors started throwing around words like motor delay and neurological instability, Marshall had clung harder to control, to structure, to improvement, therapy, schedules, exercises, progress reports. He didn't pity Caleb. He pushed him. He taught him to fight gravity every morning, to try harder when his legs wouldn't cooperate. And though it sometimes left Caleb exhausted, Marshall saw it as love. Love that demanded strength. That's why what happened yesterday had rattled him in a place he couldn't name. He hadn't spoken much since the restaurant. His silence wasn't anger. It was confusion. It gnawed at him all night, watching a waitress, a stranger, cradle his son like she knew something he didn't. So this morning, as the sunlight filtered through the curtains of his townhouse and caught on the silver edge of his cufflinks, he found Caleb sitting quietly on the carpet of the living room. The boy was playing with a small wooden puzzle. His legs were crossed awkwardly, one brace slightly unbuckled at the knee. There was a gentleness to him this morning, a kind of quiet steadiness. Marshall sat down beside him. Not across. Beside. Caleb didn't look up, but he didn't pull away either. After a long moment, Marshall asked, almost too softly to hear himself, "You liked her, didn't you?" Caleb gave the faintest nod, his eyes still focused on the puzzle piece in his hand. Marshall continued, "You liked her because she carried you?" Another nod. This one firmer. Marshall looked down, his hands twisting together. Then he asked gently why. What did she do that was different? There was a pause. Caleb set the puzzle piece down. Then, without speaking, he reached over and picked up a thick crayon from a nearby box. With slow, careful movements, using his left hand, the one that worked better, he began to scribble something on the back of a magazine page. The letters were uneven, shaky. A few were backwards. But the message was clear. She didn't make me stand up. She stayed when I was on the floor. Marshall read it once. Then again. Each word slicing through something in him he didn't know was still soft. She stayed. Not she helped. Not she lifted. Not she encouraged. She stayed. Marshall had never done that. Not once. Every fall was followed by a demand, "Get up." Every stumble was an opportunity to try again. Every tear was a chance to be tougher. He had taught his son how to stand. But he had never taught him that it was okay not to. And this waitress, this young woman he hadn't even thanked, had shown Caleb, in one quiet moment, that he didn't need to earn comfort. That he didn't have to rise in order to be worthy of being held. Marshall's throat tightened. He stared at the note, at the jagged letters written by a hand that had to fight for every curve. Something in him cracked. All those years of pushing. All the lessons built on strength, discipline, and forward motion. All the expectations stacked like scaffolding around a little boy who just wanted someone to sit on the floor with him. Marshall leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He pressed his palms together and let out a long, uneven breath. Caleb gently reached over and touched his father's arm. No words. Just that small hand. That same quiet presence. And Marshall realized, maybe for the first time, that his son didn't need someone to lead him forward. He needed someone to stop moving long enough to be with him where he was. And somehow, she had known that. The back lot behind the restaurant was where silence went to breathe. The buzz of downtown traffic faded behind the thick brick walls, and the only sounds were the soft hum of the refrigeration unit, the distant rattle of a delivery truck 2 blocks over, and the sharp crack of gravel shifting under a pair of polished leather shoes. Nora was leaning against the wall near the employee entrance, still in her uniform, her apron folded neatly over one arm. Her shift had just ended. The shadows were long now, stretching low and golden across the asphalt. She had come out here to breathe, not because she was tired, but because she needed a place where no one was watching. That's when she heard the footsteps. She didn't look right away. Something about them was deliberate, steady, weighted. Not like a coworker coming to borrow a lighter or bum a ride. These footsteps carried hesitation wrapped in purpose. When she finally turned, Marshall Hale was already there. He stood a few paces away, framed by the evening sun, his coat draped over one arm, his other hand resting at his side. He looked out of place among the dumpsters and cracked concrete, but he didn't seem to notice. Or care. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Nora straightened slightly, her expression unreadable. She didn't cross her arms. She didn't shrink back. She simply waited. Marshall cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was low measured. Not rehearsed. Not polished. Just real. "I spent most of my life," he began, "teaching my son how to stand." He looked down briefly, as if embarrassed by the admission. "I thought that was the most important thing a father could do. Stand tall. Get back up. Keep going. Over and over, until it stuck." Nora's face softened just slightly. But she still didn't interrupt. Marshall looked back up at her, his eyes meeting hers fully now. But then I watched you hold him. Not because he needed to get up. Not because he had earned it. But because he had fallen. He paused. The words settled between them like dust on pavement. I taught him how to stand, he said again, more quietly now. But you're the first person who ever taught him what it means to be held. Nora blinked. Once. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Marshall reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small cream-colored business card. He extended it toward her, not forcefully, but with the weight of something unspoken behind it. If you're thinking of leaving this place, he said gently, I'd like to offer you somewhere else to land. He didn't elaborate on what somewhere else meant. He didn't mention titles or salaries or opportunities. He just let the invitation hang in the air, an open door, not a transaction. Nora looked down at the card in his hand. Then back at him. There was no flash of shock in her expression, no visible shift. But something quiet passed between them, acknowledgement, maybe. Or respect. She reached out and took the card. Not with eagerness. Not with hesitation. Just clarity. Marshall gave a small nod, like a man who had said everything he came to say, and turned to leave. He didn't offer thanks. He didn't ask forgiveness. And Nora didn't ask for either. Because what had happened between them wasn't about apologies or debts. It was about presence. About showing up. And staying long enough to matter. The auditorium was nothing like the restaurant. There were no clinking plates. No bursts of laughter. No murmurs of judgment behind folded napkins. Just rows of suits and name tags, polished shoes and silent anticipation, all seated in a sunlit conference center adorned with glass and wood. The kind of place where decisions got made. Where legacies were measured in impact and innovation. The banner above the stage read, Held First, Emotional Readiness for Special Needs Caregivers. It was the first conference of its kind, a new program, co-founded by Marshall Hale and a woman few of the guests had ever heard of. But they would remember her name soon enough. She didn't speak today. Nora wasn't up there to present. She stood in the wings, partially obscured by the curtain, a soft smile on her face and her hands held loosely in front of her. She didn't need the spotlight. She had done her part. On stage, the microphone stood a little too tall for the boy about to approach it. A staff member adjusted it with a quick twist, then stepped back. Caleb walked forward. His gait was slow, uneven, but confident in a quiet way. He wore a simple button-down shirt, his braces freshly cleaned, his hair carefully combed. He didn't look around the room. He didn't glance at the crowd of executives, educators, clinicians, and non-profit leaders all waiting to hear something profound. He just stood there, breathing softly. No note cards. No printed speech. After a pause, he leaned toward the mic. Sometimes I fall, he said, his voice small but steady. A hush rippled through the room. But now, he continued, glancing briefly to the side of the stage, someone always stays. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. People shifted in their chairs, not because they were uncomfortable, but because something real had just landed in front of them, unexpected and undeniable. Not a pitch. Not a strategy. Just truth, wrapped in the voice of a child who had lived it. Caleb didn't say more. He didn't need to. He stepped back, gave a slight nod, and returned to his seat. Applause didn't erupt immediately. It rose slowly, like waves building momentum. By the time the room stood in ovation, Nora still hadn't moved. She stood off stage, hands clasped at her waist, her eyes full and glistening. She hadn't taught him to speak. She hadn't trained him in confidence. She had simply stayed. And because of that, everything else had followed. Marshall stood a few feet behind her, watching not just his son, but her. The woman who had once been a waitress in a 5-star restaurant. The woman who had once defied the silence of a room with the simple act of picking up a child. He hadn't known back then that she'd become a partner in more ways than one. That together they would build something not rooted in therapy or technique, but in presence, in permission, in emotional literacy for people whose voices were often lost in clinical charts and behavior reports. He hadn't known she'd become the first person Caleb ever reached for, without being told to. The program they built, Held First, wasn't about fixing. It wasn't even about progress in the traditional sense. It was about creating space where falling wasn't failure. Where someone stayed. And now, here they were. Caleb had spoken to a room full of decision-makers with the ease of someone who knew he didn't have to prove himself. Because someone had already proved to him that he mattered. Nora wiped a tear gently from her cheek, her hand trembling just slightly, then returned it to its familiar resting position, ready always to carry again. Have you ever been laughed at for doing the right thing? Sometimes, that laughter doesn't mean you were wrong. It just means others didn't have the courage to do what you did. If you believe in moments that silence a room and move hearts, like and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. And share with us. Have you ever done something people laughed at? But later, they just stood in silence?